A deserted Wyoming road, a setting sun, and a crying child. What happens next defies belief. A group of wild Mustang horses surrounds a 7-year-old boy, lost and alone, as the golden haze of dusk settles over the vast Wind River Valley. Most would assume these powerful, untamed animals pose a deadly threat, but what these magnificent creatures do next will challenge everything known about the natural world. Led by a majestic black stallion, marked with a mysterious white star on his forehead, these wild horses form an impenetrable protective barrier around the frightened boy. This extraordinary behavior, witnessed by a reclusive Vietnam veteran, sets in motion a profound chain of events, a series of revelations that will uncover long-buried secrets, unite a divided community, and reveal an astonishing connection between a child and the wildest creatures roaming the American West. As looming threats from relentless developers target both the Mustangs' ancestral territory and the boys' family ranch, unlikely alliances will form, even including a notorious motorcycle club with their own fierce code of honor. What unfolds is an unforgettable story of unyielding courage, unwavering loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. A saga that will leave even the most seasoned wildlife rangers in disbelief. The sun had begun its slow descent over the immense Wyoming landscape, stretching long, deepening shadows across the quiet, rural road. The air, crisp and clear, carried the faint, earthy scent of sagebrush mixed with the sharper tang of pine from the distant mountains. It should have been an evening steeped in peace. Yet for one small child, it was anything but. 7-year-old Joshua Blackwood sat huddled on the ground near the roadside, his tiny body trembling as raw sobs racked his chest. His jeans were torn at the knees, and his small hands were scraped, remnants of a fall he had taken while running. He had wandered too far from his grandmother's ranch, drawn by the fleeting chase of a jackrabbit, and now a chilling dread consumed him. He had no idea how to get back. His little heart hammered against his ribs with pure fear as he choked out calls for his grandmother, but only an echoing silence answered. The road stretched endlessly, a ribbon of desolation in both directions. And aside from the occasional rustle of tall grass, the quiet was eerily profound. "Grandma!" Joshua cried out again, his voice breaking, small and thin against the vastness. "Grandma! Where are you?" Only the wind offered a reply, whistling softly through the sparse sagebrush, a mournful, indifferent sound. Joshua instinctively hugged his arms around his small frame, trying desperately to muster courage, but fresh tears streamed relentlessly down his dirt-smudged face. The fading light deepened the shadows, making them stretch longer, more threatening, and his vivid young imagination transformed every rustling bush into a lurking danger. "Please," he whispered to no one in particular, his voice barely audible, "I just want to go home." Then suddenly, the oppressive silence was broken by movement. A soft, rhythmic rumbling sound emerged from beyond a nearby hill, quickly followed by the distinct, powerful thud of hooves against the hard-packed earth. Joshua's breath hitched in his throat, a sudden, sharp intake of air as he slowly turned toward the approaching noise. His wide, tear-filled eyes, reflecting the last vestiges of the fading light, locked on to the figures emerging. From the golden haze of sunset, a magnificent group of wild Mustangs stepped onto the road. Their powerful bodies moved with a mesmerizing grace and purpose, their coats gleaming like burnished gold and obsidian under the fading sunlight. Their eyes, sharp and alert, surveyed the vast emptiness around them. Leading the charge was an awe-inspiring black stallion, his dark head crowned with a distinctive mysterious white star on his forehead. "Horses," Joshua whispered, a complex mix of fear and sheer wonder mingling in his small voice. Joshua's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the Mustangs completed their encirclement, forming what appeared to be an impenetrable protective barrier around him. His small fingers dug instinctively into the dirt, his body shrinking back, every fiber bracing for impact. Were they going to trample him? The black stallion took a deliberate step closer, his ears pricked forward, his intelligent eyes carefully scanning the boy. Joshua let out a tiny, involuntary whimper, frozen in place. These were no gentle farm animals. They were wild Mustangs, untamed and unpredictable. "Please don't hurt me," he whimpered, the words barely audible. The stallion let out a soft snort, his breath visible as a delicate mist in the cooling evening air. Then, incredibly, he lowered his massive head and gently nudged Joshua's shoulder with his velvety muzzle. Joshua flinched at first, a sudden shock of contact, but then a different sensation washed over him. The horse wasn't attacking. Instead, the stallion's gesture seemed almost comforting, a silent reassurance. Another Mustang, a dappled gray mare with a calm gaze, stepped closer, sniffing the air around the child. Her tail swished gently as she too lowered her head toward him, an undeniable curiosity in her movements. Slowly, a profound realization dawned on Joshua. They weren't here to harm him. They were curious, perhaps even protective. His tears, which had been flowing freely, now slowed to a trickle as he stared into the intelligent eyes of the magnificent horses surrounding him. Do you know where my grandma is?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course, the horses couldn't answer with words, but the black stallion turned his head toward the direction from which they had come, then back to Joshua, a clear, silent gesture for him to follow. Then, as if by some invisible, silent command, the Mustangs repositioned themselves. Some moved to stand ahead of Joshua, some behind, and the black stallion remained steadfastly right beside him. It was unmistakably clear now. They were leading him somewhere. Joshua hesitated for only a moment, but something in the way the horses moved, their calm and powerful presence, made him feel strangely safe. With a deep, trembling breath, he wiped the last of his tears and slowly, cautiously, stood up. "Are you taking me home?" he asked, reaching out tentatively to touch the stallion's muscular shoulder. As soon as his small hand made contact, the black stallion let out a short, sharp whinny that echoed powerfully across the vast valley. Then, in the far distance came an answering sound. The unmistakable rumble of an engine, followed swiftly by the appearance of bright headlights cresting the top of a distant hill. Thomas Redwater, a man etched by the Wyoming sun, had been driving his old dependable pickup truck back to his isolated cabin after a rare, necessary trip into town for supplies. He squinted through the windshield, his tired eyes trying to make sense of something unusual on the road ahead. At first, he thought his weary vision was playing tricks on him, a group of wild Mustangs standing in an unnatural circle around what appeared to be a small, unmoving figure. "What in the world?" he muttered to himself, leaning closer to the glass. Thomas was 72 years old, his weathered skin a testament to decades spent under the harsh Wyoming elements. His hands, calloused and strong from years of hard work, instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter. As Thomas Redwater slowly brought his truck to a halt, the Vietnam veteran felt a profound stillness settle over him. He had witnessed countless extraordinary things in his life, faced down unimaginable dangers. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever prepared him for the sight unfolding before his eyes. As his headlights cut through the deepening twilight, they fully illuminated the incredible scene. A small, vulnerable boy, completely encircled by a protective ring of wild horses. The majestic black stallion, clearly the leader of the herd, stood closest to the child, his powerful presence a silent guardian. And then, Thomas saw it. The distinctive white star emblazoned on the stallion's forehead. Star, Thomas whispered, the name a ragged breath, one he hadn't spoken aloud in years. It can't be. Remarkably, the Mustangs did not scatter at the intrusion of the vehicle, as wild horses typically would. Instead, they held their formation around the boy, shifting only slightly to allow the truck's beams to reveal him more clearly. Thomas cut the engine, plunging the immediate area into a softer, more intimate glow from the headlights, and slowly, cautiously, stepped out, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook the wild creatures. "Hello there," he called softly to the boy, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Are you all right, son?" Joshua looked up, a wave of palpable relief washing over his dirt-streaked face at the sight of another human. "I got lost," he said, his small voice shaky and thin. "I can't find my grandma's ranch." "You're a long way from any ranch I know," Thomas replied, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "What's your name, boy?" "J. Joshua," the boy stammered, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "Joshua Blackwood." Thomas felt a sudden, sharp flicker of recognition. "Blackwood? Margaret Blackwood's grandson." Joshua nodded eagerly, fresh hope sparking in his eyes. "You know my grandma?" "I know of her," Thomas replied, a flood of memories from a time long past flashing through his mind. The Blackwood Ranch bordered the eastern edge of the vast public lands where these very Mustangs roamed. Margaret Blackwood was one of the very few ranchers who had always unequivocally respected the wild horses, never chasing them off her property or calling for their removal from the range. The black stallion, Star, watched Thomas with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a deep, unexplainable recognition. He snorted softly, pawing at the ground once, a powerful, controlled motion, before taking a deliberate step back, creating an unspoken path for Thomas to approach the boy. "These horses," Thomas said, wonder evident in his voice, his gaze still fixed on Star. "They've been watching over you." "The big black one with the star?" Joshua confirmed, looking up at the magnificent stallion with profound admiration. "He's been nice to me. I was really scared, but then they came, and I felt better." Thomas slowly extended his hand, palm up, towards Star in an age-old gesture of peace. The stallion stretched his powerful neck forward, nostrils flaring slightly as he took in Thomas's scent. Then, to Joshua's utter amazement, the formidable wild horse gently pressed his velvety muzzle against the old man's outstretched hand. "He knows you!" Joshua exclaimed, his eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated wonder. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat, a swell of emotion he hadn't anticipated. "We have history. This one and I," he murmured, his voice thick with unspoken memories. He then turned his full attention back to the boy. "Let's get you home, son. Your grandmother must be worried sick." "But what about the horses?" Joshua asked, a note of genuine concern in his voice. Will they be okay? They've survived out here for generations, Thomas assured him, his gaze sweeping over the watchful herd. They know these lands better than any man. As if understanding his words, the Mustangs began to shift their positions once more, subtly opening a clear path directly toward Thomas's pickup truck. The old man offered his hand to Joshua, who took it without hesitation, his small fingers clinging to the calloused warmth. "Can the horses come with us?" Joshua asked, looking back at the silent, majestic herd. Thomas smiled gently, a hint of something knowing in his eyes. "They'll follow in their own way. They've been watching over these lands for generations." As Thomas helped Joshua into the passenger seat of his old truck, the boy looked back at the Mustangs, his gaze lingering on Star. "Thank you," he whispered, a small, heartfelt sound. The black stallion tossed his head, as if acknowledging the boy's gratitude, before turning and leading the herd away from the road and back toward the familiar hills. But they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they kept pace, running parallel to the road, their powerful forms moving with effortless grace alongside the slow-moving truck. "They're following us!" Joshua exclaimed in awe, pressing his face against the window, his eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. Thomas nodded, his mind racing with questions, trying to make sense of the inexplicable. "Yes, they are. And that's not normal, son. Not normal at all." "Why are they doing that?" Joshua asked, his eyes never leaving the magnificent animals running alongside them, their wild beauty stark against the twilight. "I wish I knew," Thomas replied, honestly, the words heavy with genuine puzzlement. "In all my years working with horses, I've never seen wild Mustangs behave this way." As they continued their journey toward the Blackwood Ranch, Thomas couldn't shake the deepening wonder about the connection between this young boy and the Mustangs, especially Star. It defied everything he understood about wild animal behavior. "Joshua," he began, his voice thoughtful, "how long were you out there before the horses came?" The boy thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know. The sun was still up high when I got lost. I was looking for my jackrabbit friend. He lives in a burrow near the big rock. But I went too far. And the horses—" Joshua's face brightened despite the recent ordeal. "What exactly did they do when they found you?" "They came over the hill, lots of them. The big black one saw me first. I thought they might run me over, but they didn't. They made a circle around me like they were keeping me safe." Thomas's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. Star had been the undisputed leader of this particular Mustang herd for years, renowned for his fierce protection of the other horses within his family band. But protecting a human child? That was something altogether different, something unheard of. Has anything like this happened before? Have you seen these horses before today?" Joshua nodded enthusiastically, a small, innocent smile gracing his lips. "Sometimes they come near Grandma's fence. The black one watches me when I play. Grandma says I shouldn't go near them because they're wild, but they don't seem scary to me." Thomas felt a chilling sensation trace a path down his spine. The Mustangs had been watching the boy, perhaps for weeks, even months, observing him from a distance. But why? In the distance, the familiar lights of the Blackwood Ranch finally came into view. Even from this far, Thomas could discern the frantic activity, the darting beams of flashlights, the hurried shapes of people searching the property. Margaret Blackwood herself stood by the main gate, her slight frame illuminated by the harsh headlights of several parked vehicles, her posture rigid with anxiety. "There's my grandma!" Joshua exclaimed, his face lighting up with a mixture of overwhelming relief and pure joy. Thomas slowed the truck as they approached the ranch entrance, in his rearview mirror just before they turned onto the driveway. He caught one last glimpse of Star and his herd. They stood proudly on a distant ridge overlooking the ranch, their magnificent silhouettes stark and unmoving against the darkening bruised purple of the twilight sky. "Joshua?" Thomas said quietly, his voice low and serious, just before they reached the gate. "Those horses did something special tonight. Something I've never seen in all my years working with Mustangs." The boy looked up at him with innocent, trusting eyes. "They're my friends." Thomas nodded slowly, a profound understanding dawning within him. "Yes, I believe they are, and that, Joshua Blackwood, is what makes this so truly extraordinary." Margaret Blackwood held Joshua tightly against her chest, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she stroked his hair. Her eyes, tired from decades of hard work and the raw torment of recent worry, were now bright with the unshed tears of overwhelming relief. The search party that had gathered, neighbors, ranch hands, and local law enforcement, stood back respectfully, allowing the grandmother and grandson their sacred moment of reunion. "Thank God you're safe," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, ragged with relief. "When you didn't come back for dinner, I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The phantom fear, still too raw, too close. Joshua hugged his grandmother tightly. "I'm okay, Grandma. The horses took care of me." Margaret pulled back slightly, confusion furrowing her lined face. "Horses? What horses, sweetheart?" Before Joshua could elaborate, Sheriff James Holden stepped forward. A tall man, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that had seen too much in his 30 years of service, he exuded a calm authority even in his concern. "Mrs. Blackwood, we should get the boy checked out, just to be safe. Dr. Mitchell is here." Margaret nodded, finally looking up to acknowledge the man who had brought her grandson home, truly seeing him for the first time. Her eyes widened with a sudden recognition, a memory surfacing from the depths of her past. "Thomas Redwater," she said, the name falling from her lips like a long-forgotten echo. "It's been years." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to social interaction after his decades of self-imposed isolation. His hands, calloused and strong despite his age, fidgeted with the brim of his worn hat. "Margaret," he acknowledged with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The boy was out on Ridge Road. Found him about 5 miles east." Sheriff Holden frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in disbelief. 5 miles? That's impossible. We had search teams in that area not an hour ago." "Well, I found him there," Thomas replied simply, his tone unyielding, unwilling to elaborate further in front of the growing crowd. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and practical hands that had delivered countless foals and calves over the years, approached Joshua. "Hey there, young man," she said warmly, her voice gentle. "Mind if I take a quick look at you, make sure you're okay after your adventure?" Joshua nodded, though his attention was clearly focused on Thomas, who was already backing away toward his truck, a silent retreat. "Mr. Thomas," he called out, his small voice carrying across the quiet ranch yard. "Are you leaving? You haven't told them about Star yet." Thomas froze, his back stiffening visibly at the mention of the name. The gathered neighbors exchanged curious glances, a ripple of intrigue passing through them, while Sheriff Holden's eyes narrowed with keen interest. "Star?" the sheriff questioned. Joshua nodded eagerly, oblivious to Thomas's obvious discomfort. "The black horse with the white star on his head. He protected me. Mr. Thomas knows him." All eyes turned instantly to Thomas, who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet than under this sudden, intense spotlight. Margaret, sensing his discomfort and the unspoken weight of the situation, gently guided Joshua toward the house. "Let's get you inside, sweetheart. Dr. Mitchell needs to check you over, and then you can tell us all about these wonderful horses." As the last of the crowd began to disperse, Sheriff Holden approached Thomas, his expression an unreadable blend of curiosity and suspicion. "Mind sticking around a bit longer, Redwater? I'd like to hear more about how you found the boy." It wasn't really a request. Thomas nodded reluctantly, a grim acceptance that his first significant interaction with the town in years was about to become far more complicated than he'd ever anticipated. Inside the modest, comforting warmth of the Blackwood Ranch house, Joshua sat at the kitchen table, a glass of milk and a plate of cookies, a silent offering of comfort, placed before him. Dr. Mitchell, her examination complete, had confirmed he was perfectly fine, aside from a few minor scrapes and mild dehydration. Margaret hovered nearby, unwilling to let her grandson out of her sight for even a moment. Sheriff Holden and Thomas entered, an uncomfortable silence settling between them, thick with unspoken questions. Joshua's face lit up at the sight of Thomas. "Mr. Thomas, did you tell Sheriff Holden about Star and the other horses?" Thomas glanced at Margaret, a fleeting, apologetic look in his eyes, before taking a seat at the table. "Not yet, son." Sheriff Holden pulled out his notepad, clicking his pen with a crisp sound. "Why don't you tell me what happened, Joshua? From the beginning." Joshua, buoyed by the presence of a sympathetic ear, launched into his story with unbridled, childish enthusiasm. He described how he'd followed a jackrabbit too far from the ranch, how he'd gotten hopelessly lost, and how he'd eventually sat down, heartbroken and scared, to cry on the roadside. "And then the horses came," he exclaimed, his small hands gesturing wildly, illustrating the dramatic moment. "A whole bunch of them. The big black one with the star on his head stood right next to me. They made a circle around me like they were keeping me safe." The adults exchanged glances, a silent, knowing communication passing between them, clearly attributing the more fantastic elements of the tale to a child's vivid imagination, a comforting coping mechanism for a frightening experience. All except Thomas, who stared into his coffee, his weathered face a stoic mask, giving absolutely nothing away. "That's quite a story, Joshua," Sheriff Holden said gently, his tone humoring. "But wild horses don't typically approach humans, let alone surround them protectively." "They did," Joshua insisted, his young voice ringing with conviction. "Tell him, Mr. Thomas, you saw them." All eyes turned to Thomas, who hesitated for a long moment, the weight of the moment palpable. "I found the boy surrounded by the Mustang herd from Red Rock Mesa," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "They had formed a protective circle around him. The black stallion, the one with the star, was standing right beside him." Sheriff Holden looked utterly incredulous, his professional skepticism warring with the boy's unwavering certainty. You're saying wild Mustangs were protecting a human child? That's— I know what I saw, Thomas interrupted firmly, his gaze unwavering, meeting the sheriff's direct. I've worked with horses all my life, Sheriff. What I witnessed tonight isn't normal behavior for wild Mustangs. But it happened. The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, his gaze sharp, trying to determine if the reclusive old man was either lying outright or perhaps not entirely sound of mind. And you say you know this particular stallion? Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. I said, the boy called him Star. That's all. But Joshua wasn't having it. Mr. Thomas called him Star, too, he chimed in, pointing a small finger at the old man. He said they have history. Margaret looked sharply at Thomas, a sudden, piercing question in her eyes. There was clearly something he wasn't telling them, a hidden chapter to this extraordinary night. Sheriff Holden, ever the pragmatist, wrote something in his notepad, his pen scratching against the paper. Mr. Redwater, I'd like you to come down to the station tomorrow. Give a formal statement. Thomas nodded curtly, already regretting his involvement. Sheriff? Margaret interjected, her voice weary but firm. It's been a long night. Can't this wait? Sheriff Holden's expression softened slightly as he looked at the older woman. They had history, too, having both lived in Pinecrest their entire lives. Just procedure, Margaret, he said, his tone reassuring. Nothing to worry about if everything's as straightforward as it seems. But there was nothing straightforward about wild Mustangs protecting a human child, and everyone in the room knew it. After the sheriff left, an awkward, heavy silence fell over the kitchen. Joshua, oblivious to the tension, continued happily eating his cookies. Finally, Margaret spoke. Joshua, why don't you go get ready for your bath? I need to talk to Mr. Redwater for a minute. Joshua looked disappointed, but didn't argue. Okay, Grandma, but can Mr. Thomas come back tomorrow? I want to ask him more about the horses. Margaret gave him a small, tired smile. We'll see. Now, go on. Once Joshua had left the room, the playful childish chatter replaced by the distant sound of running water, Margaret turned to Thomas, her expression serious, direct. What really happened out there, Thomas? Thomas sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 72 years. Exactly what I said. I found your grandson surrounded by the wild Mustang herd. They were protecting him, Margaret. I've never seen anything like it. Margaret studied him carefully, her gaze unwavering. And the black stallion? Joshua said you knew him. Thomas's gaze drifted to the window, where the night had fully settled over the vast valley, dark and silent. It was a long time ago. Thomas Redwater. I've known you since we were children, Margaret continued, her voice soft but insistent. You've never been much for talking, but I know when you're holding something back. Thomas met her gaze, finally. The black stallion. I helped him once. Years ago, when he was just a foal. His mother had been killed in a Bureau of Land Management roundup. He was wounded, left behind. And you saved him, Margaret finished, understanding dawning, a quiet realization spreading across her face. Thomas nodded. Nursed him back to health at my cabin. When he was strong enough, I released him back to the wild. Never expected to see him again. Yet he recognized you tonight, Margaret murmured, a hint of awe in her voice. Appears so. Margaret took a seat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the small gesture betraying a deep unease. Why would he protect Joshua? Thomas shook his head, a genuine frustration in his gesture. I I don't know. It doesn't make sense. Wild Mustangs don't form bonds with humans the way domestic horses do. They're survivors. They avoid people. Yet they surrounded my grandson. Protected him. Thomas had no answer for that. No logical explanation that fit his decades of experience. The silence stretched between them, thick with unanswered questions and the unsettling weight of the inexplicable. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said finally, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "This isn't the first time Joshua has mentioned the Mustangs. He talks about them watching him from the ridge above our east pasture. I thought it was just a child's imagination. But now you're not so sure," Thomas finished for her, the implication hanging in the air. Margaret nodded. "He says the black one, Star, comes closest sometimes, stands at the fence line watching him play." Thomas frowned, a new wave of unease washing over him. This was getting stranger by the minute. Wild Mustangs, particularly herd stallions, didn't make a habit of watching human children. They certainly didn't approach ranch boundaries voluntarily. "Has he ever gone near them? Tried to feed them?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "I've told him repeatedly to stay away from the fence when they're near. Wild horses are unpredictable, dangerous. Yet they protected him today." Yes, Thomas mused, the single word hanging in the air, weighted with the enigma of the night. They did. The sound of running water from the bathroom upstairs broke the moment, a gentle, domestic interruption. Margaret sighed, pushing herself to her feet. "I should go help him. He's still too young to run his own bath properly." Thomas stood as well, seizing the opportunity to make his escape. "I should head back to my place." "Sheriff Holden expects you at the station tomorrow," Margaret reminded him, her voice holding a subtle warning. Thomas grimaced. "I'll be there." As he turned to leave, Margaret placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "Thank you, Thomas, for finding him, for bringing him home." The simple touch, the genuine gratitude in her voice, made Thomas profoundly uncomfortable. He'd spent too many years alone, meticulously avoiding human connection, burying himself away from the world. He nodded awkwardly, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture, and headed for the door. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, carrying the familiar scents of sage and pine, a comforting fragrance that usually brought him peace. Thomas paused on the porch, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape. In the distance, barely visible in the faint moonlight, he could just make out the silhouettes of horses on the ridge overlooking the ranch. They were still there, watchful. The black stallion stood slightly apart from the others, his powerful form unmistakable even in the deep shadows. As Thomas watched, the horse raised his head, seeming to look directly at him across the vast distance. Then, with a proud toss of his head, Star turned and disappeared over the ridge, the rest of the herd following, melting seamlessly back into the wild. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Something strange was happening in Wind River Valley. Something he couldn't explain. Something that defied all logic and his lifetime of experience. And despite his best efforts to remain uninvolved, to simply exist in his solitude, he was now undeniably right in the middle of it. The drive back to his isolated cabin was quiet. The truck's headlights cutting a solitary path through the profound darkness of the rural road. Thomas's mind was a maelstrom of questions. Why had Star and his herd protected Joshua? Why were they watching the boy? Seemingly for months. And, perhaps, most troubling, what would happen next? As he pulled up to his small, weathered cabin, tucked snugly against the base of a wooded hillside, Thomas couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that his carefully constructed solitude, his decades of deliberate detachment, was about to be irrevocably shattered. After decades of avoiding the complications of human interaction, of living with only his memories and regrets for company, he was being drawn, inexplicably, back into the world. And it had all started with a lost boy and a herd of wild Mustangs. Inside his sparse cabin, Thomas lit a kerosene lamp, its soft, flickering glow casting dancing shadows across the simple room, and settled into his worn armchair. On the rough-hewn table beside him sat an old photograph in a simple wooden frame, the only personal item visible in the entire room. In it, a much younger Thomas stood beside a magnificent black horse. Not Star, but another from long ago, a military service horse. Both man and animal bore the unmistakable markers of war, uniformed, disciplined, prepared for duty. Thomas picked up the frame, his calloused fingers tracing the outline of the horse's familiar, noble profile. "What do you make of all this, old friend?" he murmured to the empty room. Only silence answered him. But as the night deepened around his isolated cabin, Thomas knew that tomorrow would bring challenges he hadn't faced in years. People asking questions, expectations, involvement. And somewhere out in the profound darkness, a herd of wild Mustangs, led by a stallion he had once saved, was doing something unprecedented, something that defied every known truth, forming a connection with a human child. It defied everything Thomas knew about wild horses, about the natural order of things, yet he had seen it with his own eyes. Thomas set the photograph down and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. In the morning, he would have to go into town, face the sheriff, answer questions. But for now, he stood in silence, watching the night, wondering what dawn would bring. The Pinecrest Sheriff Station was a modest brick building on Main Street, its entrance flanked by wooden benches where old-timers often gathered to exchange gossip and watch the slow rhythm of small-town life unfold. This morning, those benches were occupied by 3 elderly men who fell silent, their hushed whispers dying out as Thomas Redwater approached, his weathered boots scuffing against the sidewalk. It had been years since most people in town had seen the reclusive Vietnam veteran, and his unexpected appearance caused a palpable ripple of whispered conversation and curious glances. Thomas ignored them, squaring his shoulders as he pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The reception area smelled of stale coffee and old paper, its walls adorned with community notices and faded photographs of Pinecrest's law enforcement through the decades. The deputy, a young man with an eager, almost puppy-like expression, looked up from his desk with a start of surprise. "Mr. Redwater, Sheriff Holden is expecting you. Go right in." Thomas nodded, a curt, silent acknowledgement, and made his way to the sheriff's office. Through the open door, he could see Holden wasn't alone. A well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and a tailored suit that immediately marked him as an outsider in this rugged rural community, sat across from the sheriff, a picture of polished urbanity. "Ah, Thomas," Sheriff Holden said, rising from his chair with a practiced, welcoming gesture. "Come in. This is Victor Harrington. He's acquired some property in the valley and heard about our, excitement last night." Victor Harrington stood, extending a manicured hand that contrasted sharply with Thomas's calloused, sun-worn palm. "Mr. Redwater, pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about you." Can't imagine why, Thomas replied, his voice gruff, as he withdrew his hand quickly, the handshake a brief, almost reluctant formality. Harrington smiled, though the polite expression didn't quite reach his eyes. Small towns, everyone has a story. He turned back to Sheriff Holden. I won't take up any more of your time, Sheriff. We can continue our discussion about the development permits later. As Harrington brushed past Thomas, he paused, a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation. By the way, I heard you found the Blackwood boy with a herd of wild Mustangs. Fascinating story. I'd love to hear more about it sometime. Thomas remained silent, his expression impassive, until Harrington had completely left the office, the click of the door echoing in the quiet room. Only then did he turn to Sheriff Holden, a questioning look in his eyes. Victor Harrington, the sheriff explained, gesturing for Thomas to take a seat. Businessman from Denver, been buying up land around here for the past year. Has plans for some kind of resort development. Resort in Wind River Valley? Thomas couldn't keep the disbelief bordering on scorn from his voice. Sheriff Holden shrugged, a weary gesture. Tourism dollars, jobs. That's what the town council keeps saying. Personally, I have my reservations, but it's not my call. He pulled out his notepad, a clear signal to shift focus. Now, about last night. I need your formal statement about finding Joshua Blackwood. Thomas recounted the events simply, leaving out nothing but offering no elaboration beyond the stark facts. When he described the Mustang's behavior, Sheriff Holden's pen paused on the paper. You certain they were forming a protective circle, not just curious about the boy? I know horses, Thomas replied flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. Been training them since before you were born, Sheriff. What those Mustangs were doing wasn't natural. They were protecting him. Sheriff Holden set his pen down, his gaze fixed on Thomas. And the black stallion? The one Joshua calls Star? You say you recognized him? Thomas hesitated, a flicker of an old memory crossing his features. I helped a black foal once, years back, after a BLM roundup went bad. Could be the same animal. That's quite a coincidence. Life's full of them. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas carefully, his expression unreadable. Frank Miller from the Bureau of Land Management called this morning. Said that herd's scheduled for roundup next month. Apparently, they're expanding the cattle grazing leases in that area. Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Those Mustangs have roamed those hills for generations. It's not my jurisdiction, Sheriff Holden said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. But given what happened with Joshua, I thought you might want to know. Thomas rose from his chair. We done here? The sheriff nodded. For now. But Thomas, word travels fast in small towns. People are already talking about the boy and the Mustangs. Don't be surprised if you get folks coming around, asking questions. Let them talk, Thomas muttered as he turned to leave. Doesn't change anything. But as Thomas stepped out onto the sidewalk, he knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. The careful isolation he had maintained for decades was already crumbling around him. Across the street, Murphy's Diner was doing brisk business, the morning crowd visible through its large windows. Thomas was about to head for his truck when the diner door opened and Margaret Blackwood emerged, Joshua at her side. The boy spotted him immediately. Mr. Thomas! Joshua called out, breaking free from his grandmother's hand and dashing across the empty street, his small legs pumping. "We were having breakfast. Did you talk to Sheriff Holden about Star?" Thomas looked helplessly at Margaret, who approached at a more dignified, if still hurried, pace. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper in the unforgiving morning light. "Joshua, give Mr. Redwater some space," she chided gently, a soft warning in her tone. "It's all right," Thomas said, surprising himself with the words. "How are you feeling today, son?" Joshua bounced on his toes, seemingly fully recovered from his ordeal, his energy boundless. "I'm good. Grandma let me have chocolate chip pancakes. Have you seen Star today? You think he's okay?" "I imagine he's just fine," Thomas replied, his voice softening. "Wild Mustangs know how to take care of themselves." Margaret placed a protective hand on Joshua's shoulder. "We were just heading to the bank. Some business to take care of." Something in her tone caught Thomas's attention, the subtle tightness around her mouth, the flicker of worry in her eyes that had nothing to do with Joshua's adventure yesterday. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Margaret gave Joshua a gentle push. "Go look at the toys in the window of Hanson's store for a minute, honey. Stay where I can see you." Once Joshua was out of earshot, Margaret's composure slipped slightly, the carefully constructed facade cracking. "The bank's threatening foreclosure on the ranch. I'm 3 months behind on the mortgage. Been trying to negotiate an extension, but—" She straightened her shoulders, a defiant resolve in her posture. "We'll manage. We always do." Thomas frowned. The Blackwood Ranch had been in Margaret's family for 4 generations. It was more than just land. "I didn't realize things were that tight." "Ranching isn't what it used to be," she said simply, her gaze distant. "Costs go up, beef prices stay the same. And since David and Karen died—" She trailed off, glancing at Joshua, a profound sadness in her eyes. "He's all I have left. I can't lose the ranch, too. It's his inheritance." Before Thomas could respond, a loud guttural rumble filled the street as 3 powerful motorcycles pulled up in front of the diner. The riders, clad in leather jackets, emblazoned with a distinctive logo, a skeletal cowboy astride a flaming horse, dismounted. The Frontier Outlaws. The small motorcycle club had a reputation that extended well beyond Pine Crest's quiet boundaries. Margaret instinctively moved protectively toward Joshua, but the bikers paid them no mind, heading directly into the diner, their heavy boots clanking on the pavement. Thomas watched them go, his expression unreadable. "They've been around more lately," Margaret commented, a hint of unease in her voice. "Ever since Harrington started buying up land." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Harrington? The man in the sheriff's office?" Margaret nodded. "Victor Harrington. He's been approaching all the ranchers, offering to buy them out. Some have taken his money and moved on. Others—" She shook her head, a grim set to her mouth. "He offered to buy the Blackwood place last month. I turned him down flat." "And now the bank's threatening foreclosure," Thomas said quietly, the implication hanging unspoken in the air. Margaret's eyes flashed, a spark of anger cutting through her weariness. "I'm not saying there's a connection, but it's certainly convenient timing for him." Joshua came running back, his attention completely captured by the motorcycles. "Whoa, cool bikes!" "Come on, Joshua," Margaret said, taking his hand, pulling him gently back to the task at hand. "We need to get to the bank." "Wait!" Thomas said impulsively, a sudden uncharacteristic decision. "Will you be at the ranch this afternoon? I'd like to stop by, talk about the Mustangs." Margaret looked, surprised by the unexpected request, but nodded. "We should be home by 2. As Thomas watched them walk away, Joshua chattering excitedly about the motorcycles, he found himself torn between the familiar, almost instinctual urge to retreat back to his isolated cabin and the nagging, undeniable feeling that something much bigger was unfolding in Wind River Valley. Something that involved wild Mustangs, a 7-year-old boy, and perhaps even a slick businessman from Denver. Against his better judgment, he turned toward the diner rather than his truck. Murphy's Diner hadn't changed much in the decades since Thomas had last set foot inside. The same worn red vinyl booths lined the windows, the same chipped formica counter stretched along the back wall, reflecting the fluorescent glow. The only difference was Murphy himself, now gray-haired and heavier set, but with the same quick, knowing smile. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy said as Thomas approached the counter, his eyes widening in surprise. "Thomas Redwater, back from the dead." "Not dead," Thomas corrected, his voice a low rumble, as he slid onto a stool. "Just keeping to myself." "For 20-some years," Murphy pointed out, pouring coffee without even being asked, a testament to long-forgotten routines. "Must have been quite a sight to bring you back to town." Thomas glanced toward the corner booth where the Frontier Outlaws sat, their leather jackets creaking faintly as they leaned over their plates of food, a stark presence in the otherwise mundane diner. "Heard some talk about a BLM roundup planned for the Mustang herd at Red Rock Mesa." Murphy nodded, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Next month. Frank Miller was in here yesterday talking about it. Said they're clearing the land for more cattle grazing. Those horses have been there since before any of us were born." "Times change," Murphy said with a shrug, an air of resignation in his tone. "Besides, word is Harrington's got plans for that area. Big resort project. Can't have wild horses running through the golf course, can you?" Thomas's hand tightened imperceptibly around his coffee mug. "Golf course?" "That's the rumor. A wilderness retreat for rich folks from the cities. Spa, golf course, hunting excursions. The works." From the corner booth, one of the bikers looked up, his bearded face turning toward Thomas with an unexpected interest. After a moment, he nudged his companions, then stood and made his way to the counter, his heavy boots sounding purposeful. "You're Redwater," the man said, his voice deep, the statement not a question but a confirmation. "The horse trainer? Cavalry in Nam?" Thomas eyed him wearily. "That was a long time ago." The biker extended a large, tattooed hand. "Jack. Served in Afghanistan. Different war? Same—" He left the sentence unfinished. His grip was firm, his eyes assessing Thomas with a sharp, almost military precision. "Heard you found a kid with the wild Mustangs last night. News travels fast." "Indeed," Thomas commented dryly. Jack jerked his head toward his companions in the booth. "My brother's kid works at the sheriff's office. Deputy Larson. He mentioned it." He lowered his voice, leaning slightly closer. "Also mentioned the BLM's plans for those horses." Thomas said nothing, waiting. "See, we got an interest in those Mustangs," Jack continued, his gaze direct. "Been watching that herd for years. Something special about them. Wild. Free. The way this country used to be." "Didn't figure the Frontier Outlaws for horse lovers?" Thomas remarked, a hint of dry amusement in his tone. Jack's weathered face broke into a quick, unexpected grin. "We contain multitudes." "Old Man. He grew serious again, the smile vanishing. Harrington's got the town council in his pocket. Got the bank leaning on folks like Margaret Blackwood. Now he's got the BLM doing his dirty work, clearing those Mustangs, so he can build his playground for rich city slickers. And you care because? Thomas prompted. Jack shrugged, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. Maybe we just don't like seeing the little guy get pushed around. Or maybe we've got our own reasons for wanting to keep Wind River Valley the way it is. He straightened up, his eyes meeting Thomas's with an unsettling intensity. Either way, those horses deserve better than a one-way trip to some slaughterhouse in Mexico. Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee, considering the biker's words, a new, unexpected possibility forming in his mind. I'm not looking to get involved in other people's problems. Bit late for that, Jack commented, his voice dry, a hint of amusement in his tone. The moment you found that boy surrounded by those Mustangs, you got involved. He pulled a worn business card from his pocket and slid it across the counter. You change your mind about getting involved, give me a call. As Jack returned to his booth, Thomas pocketed the card automatically. His mind was racing, connecting the implications of what he'd just learned. The BLM roundup, Harrington's development plans, the bank's relentless pressure on Margaret's ranch. It all seemed terrifyingly connected, and somehow at the very center of it all were a boy and a herd of wild Mustangs behaving in ways Thomas simply couldn't explain. After finishing his coffee, Thomas paid and headed for his truck. He had planned to go straight back to his cabin, to retreat to the solitude that had been his refuge for so many years. Instead, he found himself driving, almost against his own will, toward the Blackwood Ranch. The road took him past the eastern boundary of Red Rock Mesa, the vast, rugged landscape where the wild Mustangs often grazed. Thomas slowed his truck, his eyes meticulously scanning the landscape for signs of the herd. At first he saw nothing but the rolling grasslands and scattered junipers that characterized this wild part of Wyoming. Then, as he rounded a bend, he spotted them. The Mustang herd, grazing peacefully on a distant hillside, their forms mere specks against the sprawling backdrop. Even from this distance, he could make out the unmistakable black stallion, standing slightly apart from the others, his head raised as if watching Thomas's approach. Thomas pulled over and cut the engine. For a long moment he simply sat there, studying the horses through his windshield. The silence of the wilderness surrounding him. Then, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite explain, he stepped out of the truck. Starr watched him, ears pricked forward, completely alert, a statue of black power and coiled energy. When Thomas took a step away from the road, the stallion snorted and pawed the ground once, then twice. Then, to Thomas's utter astonishment, he broke away from the herd and began trotting directly toward him, his gait powerful and deliberate. Well, I'll be damned, Thomas murmured, his voice barely a whisper of awe, as Starr approached, stopping about 30 yards away. Thomas was struck by how much the Mustang had grown and matured since he had last held him as a wounded foal. The gangly legs had developed into powerful, muscled limbs, the fuzzy foal coat replaced by a gleaming black hide. The uncertain movements transformed into the confident, majestic stance of a herd leader. And yet, unmistakably, there was recognition in those dark, intelligent eyes. A memory. A connection. "Hello, old friend," Thomas said softly, the words feeling both strange and profoundly aright. "You've done well for yourself." Star tossed his head, his long mane catching the sunlight, then turned abruptly and galloped back to his herd, a streak of black against the green. As Thomas watched him go, a profound certainty settled into his bones. He was indeed involved now, whether he liked it or not, and the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The Blackwood ranch house came into view as Thomas crested the hill, its weathered wooden siding and wraparound porch a testament to generations of family history and hard work. A faded sign bearing the Blackwood brand, a stylized B with a flowing river beneath it, hung above the entrance to the main barn. Several horses grazed in the nearest pasture, domestic quarter horses that bore little resemblance to the wild Mustangs Thomas had seen earlier. As he pulled up to the house, Thomas noticed a dark, sleek sedan parked in the drive, expensive and completely out of place in these rural surroundings. The front door of the house opened before he could even shut off his engine, and Joshua came bounding down the porch steps. "Mr. Thomas, you came!" The boy's face was alight with excitement until he glanced back at the house, his expression suddenly uncertain, a shadow falling over his joy. Thomas stepped out of his truck, immediately sensing a palpable tension in the air. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her posture stiff and unwelcoming. Behind her, framed by the doorway, stood Victor Harrington, his tailored suit jacket draped over one arm, a calculated, almost predatory smile on his face. "Mr. Redwater," Harrington called out pleasantly, his voice a smooth, urban purr. "What a surprise! We were just discussing the Blackwood property." Thomas nodded curtly, directing his attention solely to Margaret. "Bad timing. I can come back." "No," Margaret said firmly, her voice sharp, leaving no room for negotiation. "Mr. Harrington was just leaving." Her tone made it abundantly clear this was not a polite suggestion, but a direct command. Harrington's smile didn't waver as he slipped his jacket on with practiced ease. "Think about my offer, Margaret. It's more than fair, especially considering your financial situation." He nodded to Thomas as he descended the steps, the picture of polished condescension. "Always a pleasure." Thomas watched in silence as Harrington slid into his expensive sedan and drove away, a cloud of dust billowing behind his tires on the dry ranch road, an almost symbolic act of disruption. "I don't like him," Joshua declared, kicking at a pebble with the toe of his boot, his small face a mask of distaste. "He wants to take our ranch." Margaret sighed, running a weary hand through her silver-streaked hair. "Joshua, go check on Penny. I think she's about ready to foal." The boy hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and hear the adult conversation, but eventually nodded and headed toward the horse barn, his small shoulders slumped. "Penny's nowhere near foaling," Thomas observed, a hint of a smile crossing Margaret's tired face once Joshua was out of earshot. "He doesn't know that." She gestured toward the porch where two weathered rocking chairs faced the sprawling valley. Thomas followed her, settling awkwardly into one of the chairs as Margaret lowered herself into the other, her movements stiff. "Harrington's raised his offer," she said without preamble, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Almost double what the ranch is worth on paper." "But not what it's worth to you," Thomas guessed, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. Margaret's weathered hands gripped the arms of her rocker, her knuckles white. "This land has been in my family since 1889. My great-grandfather built this house with timber he hauled down from the mountains himself." She gazed out at the rolling pastures, her eyes distant, filled with generations of memories. "Joshua was born in the upstairs bedroom. So was his father. Some things you can't put a price on." "But the bank can," Thomas said quietly, stating the grim reality. Margaret nodded, her jaw tight. 60 days. That's what they're giving me to get current on the mortgage before they start foreclosure proceedings." She turned to face him directly, her eyes sharp, accusatory. "Harrington knew the exact amount I owe, right down to the penny. Inside information has to be. Bank managers' ethics seem to have a price tag." She leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking all of her 68 years. "I've been running the numbers every which way. Even if I sell half my breeding stock, it won't be enough." Thomas wasn't sure why she was sharing this with him. They had been neighbors, of sorts, for decades, but hardly friends. His self-imposed isolation had seen to that. "I'm sorry," he offered, the words inadequate, hollow. Margaret surprised him with a short, humorless laugh. "I didn't tell you this for sympathy, Thomas. I told you because I think it connects to what happened with Joshua and those Mustangs." Her expression grew serious, her gaze unwavering. "The timing's too neat. Harrington wants this land. The bank suddenly gets aggressive about the mortgage, and then my grandson gets lost and is found with a herd of wild horses that are scheduled to be rounded up next month." Thomas frowned. "You think it's all connected?" "I don't believe in coincidences. Not in Wind River Valley." Margaret fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "The way Joshua tells it, those Mustangs protected him, like they knew who he was. Like they were sure Dios Sao, I was sending a message." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. He'd spent too many years avoiding the mystical talk that sometimes circulated among old-timers in the valley, stories of special connections between the land, the animals, and the people who had lived here for generations. "Horses don't send messages, Margaret." "Don't they?" She raised an eyebrow, a challenge in her eyes. "You're the horse expert. You tell me why a wild stallion you saved years ago would form a protective circle around my grandson." Before Thomas could respond, the distinct sound of hooves on hard-packed earth drew their attention. Joshua was running toward them from the direction of the east pasture, his small legs pumping furiously. "Grandma! Mr. Thomas, they're here! The Mustangs are at the fence!" Margaret rose quickly, concern etched on her face. "Joshua, I told you to check on Penny. But I saw them from the barn window. Star is there, too." The boy was practically vibrating with excitement, his words tumbling out. Thomas stood, something in the boy's urgency catching his attention. "Where exactly?" "The east fence. By the old oak." Joshua was already turning, ready to run back. "Come on!" Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret, a silent question passing between them before they both followed the boy across the ranch yard and toward the eastern boundary of the property. The Blackwood Ranch bordered public land on this side, rolling hills that eventually gave way to the rockier terrain of Red Rock Mesa. As they crested a small rise, Thomas saw them. The Mustang herd, standing just beyond the barbed wire fence that marked the property line. Star stood at the front, his head held high, ears pricked forward, watching their approach. "See?" Joshua exclaimed, slowing to a walk as they neared the fence. "I told you." Thomas counted at least 20 horses, mares, yearlings, and a few young stallions, all kept in check by Star's dominant presence. It was profoundly unusual to see the herd this close to human habitation, particularly in the middle of the day. "They shouldn't be here," Thomas muttered, more to himself than to the others, a deep unease settling in his gut. Joshua approached the fence slowly, his earlier excitement tempered by a newfound caution, a respect for the wildness before him. "Star?" he called softly, his voice a gentle inquiry. Then, to Thomas's amazement, the black stallion took a step closer, nostrils flaring as he took in the boy's scent across the barrier of the fence. The other Mustangs remained perfectly still, watching Joshua with intense, unblinking eyes. "Joshua! Stay back from the fence!" Margaret warned, her voice sharp with fear. "Wild horses are unpredictable, dangerous." But Joshua seemed unafraid, reaching a small hand toward the fence post, not quite crossing the boundary between domestic and wild, but close, an inch away. "He won't hurt me, Grandma. He protected me. Remember?" Star snorted, pawing at the ground with one powerful hoof, a controlled display of raw strength. Then, as if making a decision, he tossed his head and whistled, a piercing, resonant sound that carried across the valley, a primal call to the wild. The response was immediate. From the direction of Red Rock Mesa came answering calls, faint at first, then growing louder, and within minutes, more Mustangs appeared on the horizon, a rising tide of equine power. "My God," Margaret breathed, her voice a gasp of disbelief. "The whole herd must be here." Indeed. As the newcomers joined the horses already at the fence, Thomas estimated there were now close to 50 Mustangs gathered, nearly the entire population that roamed this part of Wyoming. Their behavior defied everything he knew about wild horse patterns. They should be scattered across the mesa, grazing in smaller family groups. Instead, they were gathered here, at the boundary of the Blackwood Ranch, a silent, powerful assembly. "As if they're showing themselves," Thomas said quietly, the realization hitting him suddenly. A chilling, profound understanding. Making themselves known. "But why?" Margaret asked, moving closer to Joshua, instinctively protective. Thomas had no immediate answer, but the boy looked up at him with perfect confidence, his eyes clear and unafraid. "They're saying hello. They're my friends." Star whistled again, a triumphant sound rearing slightly before settling back on all fours, his dark eyes fixed on Joshua. The display wasn't threatening. If anything, it was performative. Almost a demonstration, as if the stallion was showcasing his strength and vitality to the boy. "Grandma, can I go closer?" Joshua asked, his small voice filled with hope. "Absolutely not," Margaret replied firmly, her fear overriding any sense of wonder. "Fence or no fence, these are wild animals." Joshua looked disappointed but didn't argue. Instead, he raised his hand in a small wave. "Bye, Star. Thank you for helping me." To the adult's utter astonishment, the black stallion dipped his head, a gesture almost precisely like a nod, before turning away from the fence. With another whistle, he led the herd back toward the mesa, their movements fluid and coordinated, like a single, powerful organism flowing across the landscape. As the Mustangs disappeared over a distant rise, swallowed by the vastness of the land, the three humans stood in silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. "That wasn't normal," Margaret finally said, her voice strained. "No," Thomas agreed, his own mind reeling. "It wasn't." Joshua turned to look up at them, his young face solemn. an ancient wisdom in his eyes that belied his years. They came to say goodbye. They're going away. Something in the boy's tone sent a sudden, profound chill down Thomas's spine. What do you mean, Joshua? How do you know that? The boy shrugged, the gesture surprisingly adult on his small frame. I just know. They're going to have to leave soon. The men are coming to take them away. Margaret exchanged an alarmed look with Thomas. Joshua, did someone tell you about the BLM roundup? Joshua shook his head. No, Star told me. Star told you? Thomas repeated slowly, the words almost absurd. Not with words, Joshua clarified, as if explaining something obvious. But I could feel it. When I was lost and they found me, they're scared. They know something bad is coming. Margaret placed a comforting hand on her grandson's shoulder, a gentle attempt to soothe his fanciful notions. Joshua! Honey! Horses can't tell people things like that. The boy looked up at her, his expression earnest, unwavering. But they can, Grandma! You just have to listen, right? He turned to Thomas, his innocent eyes pleading for affirmation. You understand, don't you, Mr. Thomas? You talk to horses, too. Thomas felt Margaret's questioning gaze on him, but kept his focus on Joshua. There was something about the boy's certainty that resonated deeply with him, stirring faint memories of moments in his own childhood when he seemed to know what a horse was thinking, feeling, before anyone else did. It wasn't mystical, he had always told himself. Just acute observation, attention to the subtle cues animals gave. But this was different. Joshua hadn't been raised around horses the way Thomas had been, and wild Mustangs certainly didn't behave the way Star and his herd were behaving. There was something else at work here. Something Thomas couldn't explain. Something that defied his decades of rational experience. I think, Thomas said carefully, choosing his words with deliberate thought, that you're very observant, Joshua. You notice things about animals that other people miss. Joshua considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the explanation, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Will you help them, Mr. Thomas? The Mustangs. They need someone to help them. The simple question carried the unexpected weight of an obligation, a plea. Thomas glanced at Margaret, saw the deep worry in her eyes, not just for the wild horses, but for her grandson, for her ranch, for the uncertain future they all faced. I'm not sure what I can do, Thomas answered honestly, the words heavy with the limitations of his knowledge and past. But you'll try? Joshua pressed, his hopeful gaze unwavering. Before Thomas could respond, the distant sound of an engine caught their attention. A pickup truck approaching down the ranch road, kicking up a plume of dust behind it. That's Frank Miller's truck, Margaret said, recognizing the Bureau of Land Management logo on the door. What's he doing here? The three of them walked back toward the ranch house, arriving just as Miller parked beside Thomas's truck. The BLM officer was a stocky man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard and the sunburned complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Margaret, he greeted, tipping his hat, his voice genial. He nodded to Thomas, surprise crossing his features. Redwater. Didn't expect to see you here. His gaze then settled on Joshua, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. And this must be the boy everyone's talking about, the one who made friends with the wild Mustangs. Joshua stared at Miller wearily, edging closer to his grandmother, his earlier trust in Thomas seemingly not extending to this new arrival. What brings you by, Frank? Margaret asked, her tone civil but cool, a careful neutrality. Miller pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. Just dropping off the official notice. The Mustang gather is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Since your property borders the public lands where they range, we're required to notify you. Margaret took the paper but didn't unfold it. Seems like an awful lot of trouble to deliver this in person. Could have mailed it. Miller shrugged, his eyes drifting pointedly to the eastern pasture where the Mustangs had just been. Heard the herd's been hanging close to your property lately. Unusual behavior. Thought I'd check it out while I was here. They're fine where they are, Thomas said, speaking for the first time, his voice low and firm. No need to concern yourself? Miller assessed Thomas thoughtfully. Sheriff Holden mentioned you had some history with that black stallion? The one they call Star. Ancient history, Thomas replied curtly, his gaze unyielding. Even so. Miller glanced once down at Joshua, then back at the adults, a subtle shift in his demeanor. That herd's getting too large for the available grazing land. The gather's necessary for their own good and for the ranchers who lease the grazing rights. And it has nothing to do with Victor Harrington's development plans? Margaret asked pointedly, her voice sharp with suspicion. A flicker of discomfort crossed Miller's face, a brief ripple in his professional veneer, before he regained his composure. I don't know anything about that. I just implement the policies set by the Department of the Interior. Convenient, Thomas commented, his tone dry, heavy with unspoken accusation. Miller's expression hardened. 3 weeks, he said, gesturing to the notice in Margaret's hand. If you've got concerns about the gather, there's a public comment period. Details are in the document. He tipped his hat again, a crisp, professional gesture. Good day to you all. As Miller drove away, Joshua looked up at the adults, his young face troubled, the innocence in his eyes clouded by a dawning understanding. He's one of the men coming to take the horses away, isn't he? Margaret nodded, putting an arm around her grandson's shoulders, pulling him gently closer. Yes, honey, he is. We can't let them, Joshua said firmly, his small fists clenching, a fierce determination in his young voice. Star and his family belong here. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance over the boy's head, a silent acknowledgment of the complex, overwhelming reality they faced. A 7-year-old's pure-hearted determination was no match for government bureaucracy, corporate development plans, and crushing financial pressure. Or was it? As Thomas looked at Joshua's resolute expression, he was reminded of something his own grandfather had told him long ago. Never underestimate the power of a pure heart. It sees truths that the rest of us have forgotten how to see. Perhaps there was something to the boy's connection with the Mustangs, after all. Something that might just change everything. Word about the Mustang's unusual behavior spread through Pinecrest like wildfire. By the following evening, the story had evolved from a simple rescue to an almost mythical tale of wild horses forming a protective circle around a lost child. Inside the Pinecrest Community Center, the monthly town council meeting had drawn a crowd 3 times its normal size. Thomas slouched against the back wall, arms crossed, wondering why he'd let Margaret convince him to attend. He hadn't set foot in a town meeting in over 2 decades, and the curious glances directed his way reminded him exactly why he preferred his solitude. Mayor Elena Thompson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with a lifetime of local politics behind her, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. "Before we address the regular agenda," she announced, her voice strong and clear, "we'll hear public comments regarding the Bureau of Land Management's planned Mustang gather as this affects our community. We've invited Frank Miller from the BLM to address your concerns." Miller approached the podium, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he faced the crowd. "The gather, scheduled for 3 weeks from now, is standard procedure. The herd has grown beyond the carrying capacity of their range, and we need to maintain a balance between the Mustangs, wildlife, and livestock that share these public lands." "What happens to the horses after they're rounded up?" someone called out from the audience. Miller cleared his throat. Slight nervousness in his demeanor. "They'll be transported to holding facilities where they can be adopted. Those deemed unadoptable will remain in long-term holding pastures." A murmur rippled through the audience. Everyone knew unadoptable often meant older horses that would spend their remaining years in crowded government corrals, if they were lucky. "This is about Harrington's resort, isn't it?" The question came from Jack Reeves, who stood arms crossed at the back of the room with several other members of the Frontier Outlaws. "Can't have wild horses running through the golf course, can you?" Miller's jaw tightened. The gather was planned before any development proposals were submitted. "Then why the rush?" Margaret spoke up from her seat near the front, Joshua beside her, his small hand clutched in hers. "That herd has roamed Red Rock Mesa for generations without causing problems." "Mrs. Blackwood," Mayor Thompson interjected, her voice sharp with a practiced authority, "while we appreciate your family's long history in this valley, the BLM has jurisdiction over public lands." "And we all know you're firmly in Harrington's pocket," Jack retorted, his voice cutting through the polite murmur, earning a few supportive murmurs from the crowd and several disapproving glares from the town council. The mayor bristled. "This meeting will remain civil, Mr. Reeves, or you'll be asked to leave." Victor Harrington rose smoothly from his seat in the front row, adjusting his tie with an unhurried, confident air before addressing the room. "If I may offer some perspective?" The mayor nodded, and Harrington turned to face the crowd with practiced charm, a dazzling yet utterly disingenuous smile. "The Mountain Vista Resort project represents a tremendous opportunity for Pinecrest. Jobs, tourism dollars, infrastructure improvements. Yes, my plans include land currently shared with the Mustang herd, but I've already committed to funding a private sanctuary for some of the horses as part of the development." "Some," Thomas repeated loudly from the back, his voice cutting through Harrington's smooth delivery. All heads turned in his direction, a sudden collective shift of attention. "Not all. Not the herd as it exists now, living free as they're meant to." Harrington's smile didn't waver, a testament to his composure. "Mr. Redwater, isn't it? I understand you have a personal attachment to these horses, but surely you recognize the economic reality. This valley needs sustainable industry, not just sentiment." "Those horses are part of Wyoming's heritage," Thomas countered, his voice resonating with conviction. "Once they're gone for good." "Heritage doesn't pay the bills," Mayor Thompson remarked, her tone pragmatic, dismissive. "Many of our ranching families are struggling to survive." "And how many of those struggling ranchers have been approached by Mr. Harrington with offers to buy their land?" Thomas asked pointedly, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the room. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Several ranchers shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken truth. The mayor cleared her throat, regaining control. Let's stay focused on the BLM gather. Does anyone have specific questions for Mr. Miller? Joshua raised his hand after a moment's hesitation. The mayor acknowledged him. What if the horses don't want to go? The boy asked simply, his voice small but clear. Miller blinked,